The way I found out about slavery, I asked my grandmother, my father's mother, what were those scars on her back? Her response? Oh, well, that was from when I was a slave.
Oh, so fabulous.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel once again. It's your girl Dumebi. If this is your first time coming across my channel, you're welcome. I do hope you decide to subscribe, and if you are a returning subscriber, you guys know that I love you. It's so good to have you here. Welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about this palm colored man, a video he made basically directed to black people, and this is what he had to say.
So I just finished watching this video of this woman making food for Thanksgiving, and she was talking about the history of Black Americans and Thanksgiving. And she was talking about how Thanksgiving was one of the first holidays that people who were enslaved were allowed to celebrate. And like many Americans, specifically white Americans who learned about slavery, I'm realizing that my education around the entire topic and history is so skewed and flawed. And the amount of things that I've learned just by following Black creators on TikTok is more than I've ever learned in school. So then I started thinking about the conversations that I had with my parents about slavery when I started learning about it in school. And then it got me thinking, how do Black parents have the conversation about slavery with their children? Is it a conversation that's like you sit down and you lay everything out? Is it like something that you slowly reveal more information about because it's obviously a very traumatic topic? Or for anybody out there, was it something that your parents even talked to you about? Or was it something that was like, oh, you know, learned it in school? This is a 100% genuine question, and I just want to learn the differences of how Black families teach about slavery versus white families.
So now you can see he's really curious to know how Black people basically teach their children about slavery and their history in America. And one thing that struck me was the fact that he said it is different for them palm-colored people over there, the way they learn about things and their history, that everything is obviously skewed. And I've seen a lot of palm-colored content creators on TikTok say the same thing, that it is when they grow up and then they start to become more socially aware of things and they begin to interact with Black people, you know, they get on social media and they become more conscious, that they begin to learn the actual truth, which is so different from what they are taught as kids in school, in their churches, by their parents. So obviously the process of learning about history and becoming aware is so different for Black people and palm-colored people. And I mean, that's just the irony, isn't it? A Black person cannot afford to see the world through rose-colored lenses. So anyway, Black people actually made responses to his video. Some people were downright like, okay, why are you asking? Why do you want to know? Is it your business? But a lot more people were receptive, and then they talked about their experiences. Let's just go right ahead and hear what people have to say.
Slavery with their children.
It's never an easy talk to have, but most of us have those talks very young. Most Black people have those talks very young, and it's because we experience racism very young. Most of us have those talks around 5 or 6 years old, and it's not that our parents want to indoctrinate us or fearmonger us, but they have to prepare us for life and to prepare us for what potentially will happen, because we're all going to have those issues with racism. That's just how it is. But I remember having that talk at 6. I was in the 1st grade, and it was my first encounter with racism that I recognized. One of my classmates, and I was going to a predominantly white school, I don't recommend that for Black children, but one of my classmates called me the N-word with the hard ER and told me to go back to Africa, where I came from. Now, I had no concept of race at that age. I just knew that people were different colors. I didn't know why. I didn't care. You know, it didn't matter to me. And I wasn't taught that stuff yet. I was only in the 1st grade. So when he said that, I knew that it was intended to be mean, but I didn't know what the words meant because, like I said, I wasn't taught those things. So when my mom picked me up from school that day, I was upset still about the situation, and she asked me what happened. Now, my mom is one of the calmest people you will ever meet, but I remember her slamming on her brakes and turning right back around and taking me back to the school. And even though she was talking to me calmly, the energy in the car was really different. She's like, okay, so what happened? What did he say? And who was this? Like, getting all this information from me. And I was telling her, but I'm like, what the heck? So we go back to the school, and we went to my classroom and talked to my teacher. And I remember she told her, my teacher started bawling, like started crying. And she was like, oh my God, you know, why didn't you tell me? You know, it's not the kids, it's the parents, and they're having this conversation. I'm just like, what does any of it mean? So when we got home, my mom sat me down and we had that conversation. And she, in a way, you have to kind of take your child's innocence from them when you have those conversations with them. And that's kind of what happened. But she explained it in the most kid-friendly way that she could. But my mom wasn't one to shield me from things. When life presented itself, she taught me how to deal with it. So we had the conversation. It was a real conversation. And she was in college at that time. And I remember she had a bunch of like books by Black authors. And I was kind of a nerdy, advanced kid. So I would read her textbooks and just ask her questions and she would break it down for me. So it kind of shaped the way that I went through life and perceived people. But I remember her being very intentional about emphasizing that it's not every single individual and that it is a system or systemic issue. But like I said, it was in kid-friendly terms. So that was a conversation for me. And I think this is a good time to point out that white people, y'all need to start having these conversations with your kids because we've been having the talk forever. And you guys need to start teaching your kids what the history of the country is. They don't have to be like those people. And I know that that's just a smokescreen when people say, we don't want to teach our kids to be evil and teach them that they're bad, whatever. You don't have to teach them that. But you need to teach them what the truth is and what to expect and how to use their privilege if you believe all this stuff is wrong. So it's time for y'all to start having a talk. And there's actually a video called The Talk, and I think it was made by Procter & Gamble. But if y'all YouTube it, you can find it, and it goes through the generations of the talk. And there's a lot of interesting things to notice in that video, so I think y'all should watch it if you feel so inclined. But as far as the conversations go, they generally start very young, and no parent wants to have to rob their kid of their innocence, but it's necessary and essential for our survival to understand what the world is and how it moves.
Slavery with their children. Is it?
I'm part of the first generation of my family to not pick cotton. As the cotton picking machines were coming into transition in the cotton industry, there were still some places that occasionally used people to pick it by hand. And those cotton pickers were my mother, my father, a lot of my aunts. I know my grandma picked cotton, I know my great-grandma picked cotton. So yeah, it was kind of self-explanatory learning about the history of cotton picking, and that was definitely the thing that kind of taught me about things. So my dad was born in 1958, so he was cotton picking at 6 years old with my grandmother. And apparently my mom's side of the family was like really good at picking cotton and making their weight because they could do something with the entire stock. But yeah, that's how you learn.
How do Black parents have the conversation about slavery with their children? Is it
This is a conversation that we often call the talk. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a very Black neighborhood, go to a Black church, and attend a mostly Black elementary school. Slavery wasn't a topic that we didn't broach or that we didn't talk about. We also didn't feel this weird sense of shame that I know some people in our community feel. The way I was taught is that slavery was something that was done to us, but not something that defines us. I was more so taught that this was the history of white people, not the history of Black people. Because I was surrounded by so many Black voices, especially early on, there was never a sense of shame put into me about this thing that happened to us. If anything, it shows the initial point of our struggle with this country for our civil rights, our human rights. It shows the endurance and the power and the strength of Black people. It is a difficult conversation. It almost feels like you're taking away your kid's innocence in a way. As a new parent, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to have this conversation. Yeah, I hope that helps.
I want to learn the differences of how Black families teach about slavery versus...
So I can't speak for other Black families. I can only speak for mine because especially from what I've witnessed on this app, a lot of Black people are not knowledgeable themselves. So clearly they were not taught what they should have been growing up. But in my experience, as a child, I was told things slowly because, like you said, it's very traumatic to even talk about it. Okay? So we tell our children things about slavery based on their age and how they can understand it at the age that they are. Like my son, for instance, he's 3 years old and he has 4C hair. He has my hair. Okay. Look at it. Okay. He has that exact textured hair. Right now, I'm teaching him to love it. Even though he does not know why I'm teaching him to love it. All he knows is I have beautiful hair. Now, of course, at 3 years old, I'm not going to be like, oh, okay, well, the reason I want you to know that your hair is beautiful is because of this, this, and that. It's really just so that by the time it's time for me to teach him why I taught him at an early age to love his hair, his feelings and his confidence in his hair won't be shifted because someone else called it ugly. It's already embedded. My mother had to teach me at 10 years old the reason why I couldn't take the Sprite we had just got from the gas station into the Walmart, even though we paid for it, is because we're Black. Not to say it would have happened, but because it's a possibility in the society we live in, she just altogether wanted me to leave the Sprite in the car. So when it comes to slavery specifically, though, it has to be given in bits and pieces. It's too traumatic to just lay it all out flat out. The only time I'm going to lay it all out is if there's another adult, and then basically they can give me the boundary of if it's too much or not. But with a child whose brain is forever developing, that's something you want to lay out based on their age, based on how well they understand what you're telling them, so that way they're not overwhelmed.
About slavery with their children.
Growing up, I didn't really get the information about slavery from my parents. I got it from my grandparents. My parents really didn't have the conversation with me. I mostly had that talk with my grandparents. I was blessed in the fact that I not only got to meet my great-grandmother, but my great-great-grandmother. My great-great-grandmother, her stories were mostly passed down through my grandfather. So if I had a question about slavery that I was learning in school, I could just go to him and he would give me all the details. Not the graphic details, because he would clean it up because I was a child, but he's got his point across. One of the stories I do remember is him telling me about them splitting up families. It's one of the reasons why my family is super close-knit, and we don't really go a day without talking to one another. My great-grandmother, her family were sharecroppers as well. So she would tell me stories about the exploitation of her family post-slavery. I remember she told me a story about her being a little girl and some white man assaulted her mother, and her father defended her mom, and they had to move in the middle of the night. I remember her telling me how scared she was, and that's always stuck with me. This is why I think it's really important to actually talk to your grandparents and get their story while they still can give it to you.
With their children.
You was born in the 90s with a black grandma, you understand my pain, shorty. Every summer. Oh, this shit.
Have the conversation about slavery with their children.
I love this question because it shows how both diverse and yet unifying the experience of being black in America is. The first times I learned about race and racism, and by that extension slavery, was from my grandmother. She lived with us. She was my maternal grandmother. My dad was always working. My mom had 3 children under the age of 4. So it was my sister who was 4, my brother was 2, and I was an infant. And so my grandma moved in to help us. She's a second mom to me, and I love her. We call her Mima. When she was cooking or playing with us, she would talk about her childhood growing up in Delray Beach, Florida. She would talk about how this line, the central line in the town, would be the racial divider, that black people were on one side and white people were on the others. This was as early as I could understand English, and honestly probably even before that, because she would just be around us and talk to us about her lived experience. She would talk about the segregated water fountains, the segregated movie theaters, the segregated schools. And when I was a bit older, like 4 or 5, I would ask her why this happened. She would talk about how this country enslaved black people, that we fought a civil war, and when we couldn't justify enslaving them, we found different ways to subjugate them, one of which being Jim Crow segregation. She would talk about marching, she would talk about protesting, she would talk about striking. This is in addition to my own lived experience. I was born in New York and then grew up in Connecticut, and I saw how I was perceived differently. I watched how my family, how my siblings were racialized and treated differently just because we were black. People asked me in my suburban schools if I was bussed in from the inner city. Someone even called me the N-word in the 4th grade. So I would come home from school and ask about all these questions, and my parents would have to tell me. Mind you, I was tall, so around 5th and 6th grade, we had the talk that you're a big black boy and you will be aged up and racialized by police and other authorities. We'd have to do genealogy projects in school, and people would be like, what country are you from? And I'm like, I don't know. I ended up having to do a lot more work to figure out my own family tree than anyone else. Why was I doing genealogical research in 5th grade? Why was I scouring public records, my grandmother's letters and diaries to construct my family tree? Because enslavement and the Jim Crow South destroyed my family connection. I even wrote an article about this. There is no uniform answer to when or how families talk about enslavement and race. But some common threads seem to be that you talk about race first because of the lived experience of your elders in your family, and then also applying that to what you're seeing in your own daily life, and then the questions that come back. I could talk about this for literally years, but this is just a brief overview. Hope that helps.
About slavery with their children.
In my family, teaching about slavery is more like storytelling.
One of my great grandmas was born in 1913 and she died in 2013, like a month or so before her 100th birthday. And she's one of those people that really opened my eyes to slavery. And she's probably one of the main reasons why I'm so like pro-black. So like I said, she died in 2013 and she had an at-home nurse and they kept sending her white women. And I remember one day she's like, get that C word out my motherfucking house. Stop sending them. Send me a black woman. And when I was younger, I used to always think like, why does she hate white people so much? Because the area that she lived in was predominantly white. And I was like, why she hate white people so much? And she is surrounded by white people. And I thought that until I heard her tell stories. And I heard her daughter, which is my grandma, tell stories. And my great grandma, one of her kids was picking tobacco and they killed him because he was black and he was out of line. And they left him in the field, and she said she got a bucket. She went in the field with the bucket, sat down beside him, and waited till they took his body, and they just buried him in the field. Buried him in the field. They literally whipped him to death. And when she passed away, it was so many people at her funeral. Everybody couldn't even sit in the church, and it was a pretty big church. And in that moment, I realized that wow, like I actually met a walking book. Like she was full of knowledge, and it was an honor to meet her. And then when you meet my grandma, and she talk about back in the day about how she caught the end of slavery, but she caught most of segregation and the Jim Crow laws. And my grandma talked about how hard it was for her to get a job because she was a black woman. And you know, to put it in perspective, my grandma retired in the mid 2000s, so like 2000, like 2015, 18. So then when you hear her talking about Jim Crow and how she had to go to separate facilities and separate water fountains and separate schools, it's like, wow, like when you go to school and they show you the textbooks, so they show you the paperwork, and like the original creator said, I didn't really learn the truth about a lot of black history until I went to college, and the truth was like, uncensored, because in high school, middle school, when I got to college, I realized all that shit was bullshit. But one of the biggest things for me is we are still living in this reality. We are still living in this timeline, because then it goes to my mom, and my mom talks about the after effects of all those things. And my mom, from her point of view, her mom was always at work. She was always by herself, and she always had to prove a point that, she didn't come from a family or drug addicts and, didn't have a stable place to live. And when you think about that, my mom had me in 1998. It kind of makes me think about the mental aspect of all of this, because when you get on social media, especially a place like TikTok, where you meet so many people from around the world that's not black, it surprises me how many people say, oh, racism isn't a thing anymore. We're just holding on. Y'all need to forget about slavery. But the thing is, we're still living in the slavery timeline. Right now, we're on the back end of it. And the saddest part about it is we're still fighting to be seen as human. And then when you actually put it into a time perspective, like a timeline perspective, it makes sense that we're still battling. Because the textbooks at school put it in black and white and that ugly yellow vintage look to fool you into thinking that, hey, this happened so long ago. In reality, it wasn't that long ago. My great grandma died in 2013. That was 10 years ago. And that's one of them now, because I have the honor of being in another family where the great grandma is still alive. But anyway, my great grandma died in 2013. One of my grandmas is still alive, y'all. She's almost 80 years old. If you're a person like me, because I feel like, yes, learning education, books and stuff, it is very helpful. But when you sit down and talk to older people, and now that I really think about it, I've met the Tuskegee Airmen. But when you sit down and talk to older people and listen to their point of view on white Americans in slavery, a person like me, the first thing I thought was, wow, we're still living with the people that had to fight against this. They had to go through this. And to me, it's kind of beautiful. It's kind of honoring, but it's also extremely depressing, because it's like, wow. And we still have to walk around every day as black people and deal with the microaggressions, the macroaggressions, the redlining, the systematic racism, all these other things. And people would still look us in our face and tell us that we're over exaggerating. And we're always trying to play the race card. And it's really sad, because my grandma, she got a picture. She was very Black Pantherish back in the day. And that brings me to another point. When you look at the history of Black Panthers and people will be like, oh, they were violent. No, they wasn't. They was just trying to help the black community. But then, like, yeah, they teach you in school that the Black Panther were violent, and my grandma was a part of that. My grandma is far from violent. And as you get older, you realize that everybody said that Black people are the poorest, and we are drug infested, crime infested. What other choice did y'all give us? And that's the thing about generational poverty, generational mental health, and all these other things, because it all trickled down into my generation. And my generation is trying to make a change so the next generation can make another change, and it's just going to keep going. But yes, talking about slavery in my household is storytelling with pictures and, artifacts, because a lot of Black grandmas keep everything to the end of time.
So, listening to all of that, the long and short of it is, this phrase or this proverb that people say, ignorance is bliss. Well, for a Black person, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance can actually cost you your life. As a Black person, you cannot afford to be ignorant of the reality of the history of things that are happening around you, especially when you live in a racist, white supremacist society like America. You need to let your kids know, and as much as it is for their own good, it is quite sad, because it's like taking away the innocence of your children, letting them understand that, okay, this is how it works, this is how we are treated, this is what happened to our people, this is how you can be observant and protect yourself, and this is how you move and navigate through the world. We cannot afford to be clueless, we cannot afford to be sheltered, and we can't afford to leave our children walking around clueless about these things. And in the comment section, a lot of people were talking about how their parents played them the movie or the documentary Roots, and I've been hearing about Roots, you guys, but I have not watched it. I've heard so much about it that I know that it will tell a lot about Black history and slavery and all of that, but I don't even know how accessible it is if I wanted to watch it. And there's just a part of me that kind of fears watching all these slavery movies and documentaries, because it always leaves me frustrated and angry and traumatized. But then, if we're to say the truth, this is kind of like a necessary trauma that we must put ourselves through, and that is the sad thing. You cannot afford to shy away from this reality, because we're still living in this reality. Yes, we have it better than our ancestors did, but the after effects, the aftermath, the ripple effect of these things are still happening. We still have our own struggles. We're not there yet as human beings, and that's just the irony. For our counterparts, the palm-colored people, on the other hand, they can go about their life totally oblivious to the struggles of Black people. They can go about their lives not knowing what it means to be treated a certain way because of your skin color, or to be denied some certain privileges. Some of them are not even aware that they are living in a privileged world. They can afford ignorance. Ignorance for them is bliss. So anyway, I want to know what you guys think in the comment section. Please share your experiences. How did you learn? How did you get the talk from your parents? How was your innocence taken away from you when it came to learning about your history as a Black person, about slavery, and about how things came to be the way it is for Black people? And if you're a parent, how do you do it for your kids? How did you educate them about Black history and about slavery and the civil rights and all of that? Please just let me know in the comment section. Let's have a discussion. So please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.